Good morning, girls. Welcome to number 2 of our series in James. And this week we're going to be delving into actually the book of James. And I'm going to be taking us through chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. And it doesn't sound like a very exciting topic. It is trials and temptations. So please don't just switch off straight away. I have some great news for you, okay? So trials and temptations. In our culture nowadays, the word suffering is just not a good word. We just think it's a wrong word. We have a total distorted perception of what suffering is. We're conditioned in our culture to believe in comfort and entitlement and personal happiness and what makes you feel good. But the Bible is very different. The Bible speaks about trials and temptations. And we don't like to think of anything negative happening, but the Lord does speak in the Bible, and many people speak in the Bible, and the Bible is full of people who have gone through trials and temptations. But the good thing is they don't just get through them, they actually grow through them. And that's what we're going to be looking at today, okay? Most people count it all joy when they escape a trial, but James teaches us that he counts it all joy to endure the trial. So this little preach is in 2 parts. I'm going to speak about trials, and I'm going to speak about temptations. And I kind of used to think they were kind of both the same. But in reading this and preparing, trials are really things that God sets for us to do. Temptations are not from God. And so I'm going to speak about the 2 different things and how they kind of dovetail together and how James wants to speak to us through that. Okay? So, just reading the first couple of verses, I just wanted to read here about trials. And James wants us to not wallow in self-pity and think about our trials. He wants us to grow through them. So in verse 2, I'll just read verse 2 to 3 here. And I'm reading between different translations. I tend to read through the Passion Translation, but it might be the NIV. So just bear with me. But this happens to be the Passion. My fellow believers, my wonderful girls out there, okay? When it seems as though you are facing nothing but difficulties, see it as an invaluable opportunity to experience the greatest joy that you can. For you know that when your faith is tested, it stirs up power within you to endure all things. And when it says, but see your difficulties, the other version would say, consider your difficulties, okay? Consider. And that means to think about it. It's actually changing your thinking, okay? So how do we get through our trials? And what are trials? And why do we have trials? So there was a few things that I found from this that I just wanted to go through. There's 2 things I wanted to speak about. And the first one is, how do we embrace the trials that God brings into our lives, and how do we grow through them? How do we use them for the maximum effect in our lives? So there's a few characteristics about trials I found out. Trials are intentional, okay? You weren't in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sometimes God intends you to have some trials, okay? And the trials that God brings, they're for our benefit. But the thing about trials is He can provide a supernatural peace in your life when you are going through the trial that actually is a witness to all around you. So trials are intentional. Another thing about trials they are unavoidable. Okay? James says, if you notice what James says in verse 1, in chapter 1, verse 2, it says, not if you go through trials, but when you go through trials. So expect trials in your life. Don't think, oh, I'm in a trial, I must have strayed off the right path. No, James is saying when you go through trials. So trials are unavoidable. Another thing about trials is they're unexpected. We don't get a warning. We don't get the Lord saying you are about to go through a trial. Sometimes He does. Remember that story in the Bible where I think it was Paul, and someone said, I believe you're going to be, if you go back to Jerusalem, you're going to be bound. And they warned him about a trial and told him not to go. And he says, no. God is calling me and I am going to go. So sometimes God does warn us, but most times trials are totally unexpected. But we cannot live our life cowering and wondering where the next trial is coming from. You just walk, and if you walk into a trial, you embrace it. So they are unexpected, but that is one of the characteristics of the trials. Another one is trials are unpredictable. How you got through your last trial, how you grew through your last trial. You might experience a different trial, and it's different things the Lord is wanting to teach you. So they are totally unpredictable. And it also says in James 1, trials of many different kinds, or various trials, depending the version you read. And these are trials. Sometimes you'll have emotional trials. Sometimes it's physical trials. Sometimes it's spiritual trials. Sometimes it's trials of the mind, trials, different personal experiences that you have to go through that you didn't expect. There are many, many different kinds of trials, and they are unpredictable. You know, never say, oh, I never thought this would happen to me, because actually, you know, we often say, oh my goodness, why did this happen? And we question things, but actually there is a purpose, and we just have to cling to the Lord through these different things. The last feature about trials is that trials are painful. Trials are painful. They aren't meant to be fun. They're not meant to be fun experiences. You know, many years ago there was a song, don't worry, just be happy. And, and it's not that you go through life full of happiness and no worries. No, trials do come, and trials are painful. When you lose a family member, when you go through a terrible illness, when you have a mental breakdown, they are painful and hard trials. But God is able to bring you through the trials, and that's the difference. And, by nature, a trial is painful. If you look up the meaning of trial in the dictionary, it is a very painful thing. It's not a cheerful experience. But he says, consider, change your thinking, consider it joy. We can delight as we consider the overall experience of it and the overall experience that we will have when we come out of the trial. But going through the trial is not much fun. Yet we shouldn't deny the difficulties that we're going to face when we're undergoing the trial. So a trial can be painful, a trial can be difficult. So, in recapping, just about the trials there, trials are unpredictable, trials are unavoidable, trials do happen, and trials are painful. But I want to reassure you, as well as all these different characteristics, there's a second thing I wanted to mention, that God completes his purpose in our lives. How do we allow the trials to work in our lives and change us and make God's purpose prevail in our life? So if we look at verse 4, it says, so let us grow. Let the trial make us grow. Let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. So we are asked to endure. Now, endurance is very different from patience. I was thinking, if you're patient with something, if you endure something, it's the same. But actually the words mean very, very different things. You can be patient with someone. You can be sitting in a queue and you can be very impatient with the person in front. Or you can just sit there and think, there's nothing I can do about this queue. I'm just going to be passive and I'll wait until it ends. So you can be patient. Being patient in that situation, you're just sitting waiting until the situation finishes. But to endure something is when you stay strong and you stay upright when there is pressure on you, okay? And that's what he's asking us, not to just be patient and sit there passively waiting for a trial to happen, close our eyes, bury our heads like an ostrich in the sand and wait till the trial passes. No, stand strong, look it in the eye, and stay and endure underneath it. And that's what he's asking us to do. It's almost best translated, the word endure, to be steadfast or to have that staying power. It's a quality. The quality is the strength to remain under a weight or pressure until it is removed or completed its purpose. Okay? So that's what it kind of means to endure. And our trials, for the trial to have its fully, and I think this is really important, for the trial to be fully finished and fully completed, it has to be fully endured, okay? So for the trial to be completed in our lives and to grow through that trial, we have to fully endure the trial and work with it and stay strong in the trial. God is taking us through it. And some of you might say, but why should we endure something? Why can't we just be passive about this? Because it then goes on and says, so that you will be perfect and complete, lacking in absolutely nothing. And those two qualities, perfect and complete, that's actually maturing us. I was thinking about a plant in my house, and if a plant is in a pot, its weather situation is perfect. I feed it water and it just sits there and it grows. But the growth is stunted. The growth will only grow according to the little pot I have it in, and those roots will only allow it to mature according to where it's been restricted. But a plant out in the wild, yes, it has to endure the storms of life. Yes, it has the winds and everything battering round about it. Yes, it goes through dry seasons and wet seasons. But it can flourish because the roots can spread out, it can grow in every season, and it can grow huge. If you look at a little bonsai tree, it's so stunted, it's so small. Yes, it looks perfect, but it's just perfect in that size. It's never going to be the proper tree that it was meant to be, because its growth has been stunted. And so these trials, see them, James is saying, as an opportunity to grow, to stretch your wings, to stretch those spiritual muscles, and to grow and be all you can be in God. Okay? And if I read these next verses, if we go into verses 5 to 8, it says, if anyone longs to be wise, James says, ask God for wisdom, for he will give it generously. He won't see your lack of wisdom as an opportunity to scold you for your failures, but he will overwhelm you with your failures with his beautiful, generous grace. Isn't that lovely? And when you ask him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave in the sea that is blown and tossed about by the wind. When you are half-hearted and wavering and it leaves you unstable, your loyalty is divided. You will be unstable in everything that you do. So there's two critical things here James is saying. James is saying God is so generous, and if you ask him for help, if you ask him for wisdom, he will give you in abundance the wisdom and everything else you need. And the second thing is he is willing to forgive any mistake. If you slip up, if you don't make that trial, if you stray off the way. I love those words. They are so beautiful. I think it's in the Passion Translation. He will overwhelm your failures with generous grace. Isn't that beautiful? That whatever you have failed in, whatever trial you have been in, or the ones you haven't worked out, that he will overwhelm your failures with his grace. And that's what James is saying to the believers there in the early church, and he's speaking to us as well. James also has that warning I read about divided loyalty. You need to be 100% committed. If you're in both camps, if you have your feet in two different camps, you don't know who to be loyal to. And he's saying, stay the course, be steadfast, endure, and stay strong through this trial. Don't give up, because God will bring you out and bring you through it. And the other day it was quite stormy, and we went down to there's not much to do in lockdown, is there? So we picked up a coffee from Costa and went down to the beach, and we were watching the waves crashing against the lighthouse and the Tory battery over there. And we were watching them. And there was some rubbish that was just being tossed about. There were some boats trying to come into the harbour, and it was really difficult. They were really having to steer hard because the waves were so strong. But that lighthouse, it just stood so stoic, so strong, and it never flinched. The waves didn't flinch it at all. It just stood there. And that's what he's telling us to do, to be strong and to stand up under trials. And you know, James was writing this. Many believers, you know, Stephen had been martyred. The other James in the Bible, he had also been martyred. There were people who were dying. There were people who were having to suffer for Jesus. And he's encouraging the church there and saying, stand strong and don't worry about this trial. God will grow you through this trial and you will be like that lighthouse. It doesn't matter what comes your way. You will be strong. So the second part of this is temptations. So we see all those characteristics about trials. Trials are purpose-built almost. They're for you. And you know, we all go through different trials. Don't look around and think, oh my goodness, they haven't had that trial. I wish I had their life. You don't know the trial that they might come, because remember I said trials are unexpected. So never compare your life or your life journeys with other people's trials. I often find myself looking at some people, some trials some people have, and I think, God, you have given me such an easy life. I have such an easy life compared to other people, and that softens my heart, and it keeps my attitude of gratitude so important. You know, to just keep that soft heart is really important. So that's what trials are. Now, temptations. I want to say at the onset, temptations are not from God, okay? Temptations are not from God. And maybe to save myself reading all of this scripture, it is verses 12 to 16, and I'll read a little bit of it, and then I'll reference it, okay? If your faith remains strong, even when surrounded by life's difficulties, you will continue to experience the untold blessings of God. And then he goes on in verse 13, when you are tempted, don't ever say, God is tempting me, for God is incapable of being tempted by evil, and he is never the source of temptation. And I just think that's so important. And then it goes on in verse 14 and tells us about temptations. Temptations come from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and he speaks about it. And the one key thing I want to say about temptations is, temptations is a process. It's not an event, okay? Temptations is a process, okay? You don't just suddenly waken up very, very far from God. It's a process, and that's what James is talking about here. Two things. Temptations are universal. From the moment we're born, from the moment we're born into this world, we are in a battle with temptations. It's just what happens. Even Jesus, the perfect Jesus, the first thing that happened after he was baptized and he went into the desert to pray, he was tempted. He was tempted before then, but there was those huge temptations that he had. He had to battle those temptations. So don't think that you're immune, okay? And if you have gone through very areas of temptation, I just want to say you're in good company, because guess what? We all have temptations. So temptations are universal and temptations are personal, okay? Satan knows your weakest point. He knows the area that you find the hardest, and he will come and he will tempt you in those areas. There are certain areas that I would never be tempted with. I am someone, you know, for example, I could be in a room full of alcohol or full of drugs, and I would have no temptations in that sphere. But put someone else in that situation, and that would be their biggest challenge. Put me in a room with a bunch of girls, and I would be so tempted to start gossiping, and other people wouldn't have that challenge. So none of us are immune from the temptations. They are personal. So be aware that the temptations you face, they are personal. They are universal, but they're also personal. Where do temptations come from? Let's go back to the very beginning of the Bible, Adam, okay? And when Adam was tempted and he was caught, he was like, well, it's Eve, it's her fault. And then when the Lord spoke to Eve, she was like, oh, it's not my fault. It's Satan. And you know what? They're just like us. How many times do we make these excuses? Oh, I'm just made this way. It's my personality. I just happened to walk in and somebody forced me to do it. I was just having a bad day. We're always making excuses for falling. But I love what it says here in verse 13. When you are tempted, never say God is tempting me, because he is incapable of being tempted by evil, but he is never the source of temptation. Ultimately, the other thing is, and this is a sad bit to let you know, we are the ones that have to take responsibility for the temptations that we face. Ultimately, we're at fault, because we need to take responsibility and say, you know what, it comes from our own desires. And that's why, in Proverbs 4:23, one of my favorite verses, it says, guard your heart, for it is a wellspring of life. And, so many things are seated in the heart, and that's where we have to constantly, every day, guard our heart, see how things are, check out your heart, and just see what's going on. So temptation, I said, is not an event, it's a process, and James speaks to us about the process. First, it begins with desire, okay? We're all born with a sinful nature that is hell-bent on, on trying to pull us into sin and trying to pull us away from the Lord. So we have those desires, and we have to look at those desires and check them out, and just check out your heart. So those desires that are there, we have to almost recognize, are these godly desires, or are these desires that are pulling us away? They all happen to be D's. The first begins with desire. The second thing leads to deception. Because we are dragged away and enticed into something, we can sometimes be taken away and distracted. It's kind of like fishing. When you go fishing, you put I can remember as a child going and putting a little worm at the end of a hook, and you send it in there, and you put that bait in there. And there's two purposes of that bait. The bait is to attract and lure the fish. But the second purpose of the bait is actually to hide the hook. Okay? And that's what it's like with the desires of sin. The first thing is to make sin look attractive, to make those desires look attractive. And then the second thing is to cover the end product, or what's going to happen after you fall. And it's that hook that gets in there, and that's when it's always so difficult. It's the first lure to get the fish to the bait, and then the second is to hide the hook. And we are enticed by sin for this very simple reason. Not only is sin attractive, but we are also unable to see the hook it can have in us, the one step that it takes us down that downward spiral. The third D is when we are deceived, it leads to disobedience. So you have desire, and if you are deceived by the desires, then you end up disobeying. And these two elements can be really harmful. And it doesn't just lead you down a wrong path, but it can give birth to sin. And that's not just talking physical sin, but sometimes spiritual sin, And the last thing is, it can lead, the combination of this is, it leads to disobedience. And ultimately, it leads to, death, spiritual death, and you just find yourself, away from the Lord, not wanting to read your Bible, struggling with different issues, going back and thinking, well, I did this, I know it was wrong, but it made me feel good at the time, so I think I'll go back again. Check your heart. What are you watching online? What little secret sins are you having? What thoughts are you having? What areas of your life that nobody else knows about that is taking you down the wrong path? And it's so easy. You just need to check your heart. You just need to come before the Lord and say, Lord, you are not the source of temptation, but you can help me in this area. I wanted to finish with a story just now. And the story, before I tell the story, I was talking about temptation, how it's a downward spiral. So I wanted to finish with this story. It's really a very, very powerful story. I want to talk, it's about a man called Joseph Scriven. And Joseph Scriven lived in Dublin. And he lived in the south of Ireland in 1819. He grew up in a very wealthy family. And he wanted for nothing. He was very well, his parents were very wealthy. He went to the good schools. But there was something within him that was drawn to the poverty of the people in Ireland. And he was drawn to the peasants, and he was drawn to the poor people, and he was always trying to help them and that. And he did his studies and that because he was from a good family, but he always wanted to see how he could help people. And anyways, one day he met somebody and he fell in love, and they were engaged to be married. And the day before he gets married, they're horseback riding, and his fiancée is on a horse, and the horse is startled, and they're crossing a bridge, and she is thrown off her horse, falls into the river, and sadly she strikes her head and she drowns the day before he gets married. And he's absolutely heartbroken and absolutely devastated, doesn't know how he can pick himself up. And the story goes on that, he just couldn't see, everywhere he looked, he could just see his fiancée. So he decided he would immigrate to Canada. So he went off to Canada and immigrated there. And went there, and during the first harsh winter there, he found it just so hard. He was in Ontario, that he just couldn't bear the cold, that he actually came back to Ireland, and he came back and stayed there for 2 or 3 years, fell in love with someone else. And as the courtship was going well, she then dumped him because this new girlfriend fancied his friend. So just feeling so rejected, thinking, you know what, I'm going to go back to Canada. I'm going to make a go of it. So he went back to Canada. And again, he was so drawn to helping people that he had an axe. He had something in his hand. He had an axe, and he would saw wood, and he made a living doing that and helping people and looking after people and just being a really kind person. Almost began to live a hermit existence. Just whatever he made money from, he sewed it back into the lives of people. And he met another person. And this person, her name here, in 1980, and this is in 1854, he's now 35 years old. He's met a girl called Eliza Roche. She's 23. They get on wonderful. He loves the family. They get on really well. They're dating. I'm not sure if they got engaged, but she becomes gravely ill. I think it was with something like scarlet fever, which is curable nowadays, but in those days was fatal. And she passes away. And he's just absolutely devastated. He thinks, this is just not for me. So he actually becomes almost like a hermit, and he loves the Lord. He's never fallen away from the Lord. Talk about trials. Talk about going through such difficult times. But through these trials, he grew and grew. And he lived a very poor, meager existence, helping people and looking after people. And then he hears that he gets a letter from his beloved mum in Ireland, and she's gravely ill. He doesn't have the money to go and visit her. So he writes a poem. And the poem he writes her is, so difficult to say this, what a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Have we trials and temptations? Is there trouble anywhere? We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer. And then the last verse says, are we weak and heavy laden, cumbered with a load of care? Precious Savior, still our refuge. Take it to the Lord in prayer. And then it says, do thy friends despise, forsake thee? Take it to the Lord in prayer. In his arms he'll take and shield you. You will find your solace there. And he couldn't go and see his mum, but he penned this verse to her and he sent it. And he says, Mum, this is a poem I've been writing. Because he used to write lots of poems and songs. And she got it, and it comforted her. But he said, Mum, I can't be there, but Jesus is there. And he will be your friend when I can't be there. We know that song. We've sung that song. But we didn't realize the pain that man endured to write those words. It was so powerful. I've read about it and watched it, and I found it so difficult. I thought, I hope I can tell this story without crying, because it is really emotional. Many years, about 10 years later, I think it was in 1965, he put the poem forward, but he didn't put his name to it, and the poem was published anonymously, and everybody loved the poem. Everybody took to this poem, and it was published many times, and nobody knew who the author was. And about 10 years later, he was sitting with a friend, and his health wasn't well, and he was talking to his friend, and he said to his friend, can I show you something? And he went into a drawer, and he took out his notebook, and he showed him these words. And the man looked at it, and at the bottom it has his name, Joseph Scriven. And he said, "Oh, are you the author?" And he said, "I am, actually." He said, "Actually, it's not just me. The Lord and I wrote these words together." And I thought it was so beautiful. He died about 11 years later. He was a very ill man. He became very ill, and actually I think he ended up drowning. He had, he was someone who had had a very hard time. But he had no idea, but those words were then put to music by someone else who they didn't ever figure out who had penned the music for those words. But he died and went to heaven. He felt very depressed at the end of his life, thinking that he had done so little for the Lord. He hadn't really done much. He had just endured trials. He had grown through trials, but he hadn't really changed the lives of the poor people round about him. But that song has been translated about 50. I think it's been translated into about 100 different languages. That song has been printed about 50 million times, according to the information I was reading. And some of the great evangelists that had crusades at that time used that song during the altar call. When Billy Graham has an altar call and he used to play "Just As I Am" without one plea, and that's when everybody came. Well, for many, many years, this song was the song that was played, and the choirs would strike up and sing, "What a friend we have in Jesus." And people would stream down to the front and find their Savior. This was a man who had endured so much. He has no idea what his little song was going to do in the hands of Jesus. And I just think it's quite amazing that, as I finish talking about this section on trials and temptations, if you're going through a trial, don't worry. God will grow you through the trial. If you consider it joy, if you choose to think, yes, I know what's going to happen. God is going to do something great out of my life. Keep a thankful heart. And the second thing is, I want to say, it's, life is like running a race. And when you're in your lane, it's your lane that God has given you to run. Don't look at the person running beside you. They have their own trials. They have their own things. This person might be running a hurdles. This person might be running a marathon. This person 2 lanes long might be running a sprint, okay? We're all running different races, so don't compare your trials. And certainly don't compare your temptations, because temptations are personal. So be gentle with people. When you hear in the media about wonderful people, that godly people that have failed, people who have fallen by the wayside because they have succumbed to temptations, remember, temptations are universal. They are personal. We will always be tempted until the day we take our last breath. Satan will always try to trip us up. So let's not judge other people. Let's keep our eyes focused on Jesus, and let's do what James does and says, let's consider it joy when trials and temptations come, and keep your eyes focused. And just like the great hymn writer said, you will always find a friend in Jesus. He will always be your friend. He's always available, and he's there. So I hope you enjoyed that. And next week, we're going to be looking at verses 19, I think, to 27. And I think it's called Listening and Doing. So I think it's going to be really, really good. There is so much in James. It actually was difficult for me to hone it down and to just speak for 20, 25, 30 minutes on something like this. There's so much meat in here. I would encourage you, go and read it for yourself. Take your own notes. Listen to some other preachers preaching on this, and you'll find even more. God bless. Have a good day, and we'll see you on Instagram shortly. Thank you.